The bouquet of white roses in Naomi's hands only made her feel more out of place as she stood beside Alexander, who exuded cold sophistication in his tailored suit. The grand ballroom shimmered with elegance, yet the atmosphere of the wedding was awkwardly stiff. Naomi, a full-figured black woman, shifted uncomfortably, while Alexander, a billionaire accustomed to flawless supermodels, recited his vows with forced composure. Then came the moment. "You may now kiss the bride." Alexander hesitated, a flicker of unease flashing in his eyes. The idea of pressing his lips to Naomi's cheek felt foreign, almost absurd. A few guests clicked their cameras, but there were no enthusiastic cheers, no joyous applause, only a quiet, stifled tension. Both of them knew the truth. This wasn't love. It was a performance. To understand how these two opposites ended up at the altar, let's go back to where it all started, with a bet that changed everything. Before we begin, let me know where you heard this story from. Don't forget to follow the channel to hear more exciting stories tomorrow. Alexander Pierce stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse in downtown Chicago, gazing at the sweeping view of glittering skyscrapers and bustling streets below. To the rest of the world, he was a self-made billionaire, one of the most influential investors in the city, a man whose name was synonymous with both power and prestige. Wearing an exquisitely tailored gray suit, Alexander exuded effortless confidence. His dark hair was always styled to perfection, and his eyes held a calculating gleam that had served him well in countless negotiations. Yet, for all his outward poise, Alexander felt a persistent sense of boredom tugging at him. At 38, he had climbed so high that nothing, not the lavish parties, not the accolades from business magazines, not the exclusive clubs, seemed to excite him anymore. Everything felt predictable, as though he was living his life on a well-lit stage where each move was scripted. That evening, he was hosting a private cocktail party for his circle of wealthy associates in the penthouse's expansive living area. The glass chandeliers sparkled overhead, refracting a warm golden light on the polished marble floors. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved silently, offering vintage champagne and canapes. Laughter and polite chatter drifted through the air, punctuated by clinking glasses. Among the crowd was Gavin Sinclair, a longtime friend and occasional rival. Gavin came from old money, a trust fund heir whose life had been one never-ending stream of indulgences. He approached Alexander at the penthouse bar, where a row of top-shelf whiskeys and brandies glittered like trophies. "You're still the talk of the town, Alex," Gavin said, swirling his glass of aged scotch. "Another profitable quarter for Pierce Financial, another reason to celebrate, right?" Alexander gave him a polite, practiced smile. "Profit is up, the shareholders are pleased, and I'm still the king of my empire. What else could I want?" A flicker of amusement crossed Gavin's face. "I don't know. Perhaps a challenge? You look like you're about to doze off from your own success." Alexander felt the faintest twitch in his jaw. "I'm sure you have something in mind." "There's always a challenge," Gavin replied, leaning against the sleek bar. "But it has to be interesting enough for you." Alexander feigned an air of nonchalance. "What did you have in mind? Bungee jumping off the Sears Tower? Investing in your next harebrained startup?" "Something far more daring," Gavin said. He glanced around, to ensure no one else was listening before leaning closer. "You're so certain you can handle anything, control anyone. But can you handle someone you cannot control?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Care to clarify?" Gavin smirked, as though he were about to reveal a grand secret. "Marry someone who doesn't fit your mold. Someone who doesn't move in your fancy circles, who isn't the usual perfect companion you trot out at business galas." A flicker of interest sparked in Alexander's eyes, but he kept his tone light. "Why would I do that?" "Because I'll wager you $50 million in investment capital that you can't do it. And stay married for at least 6 months, Gavin challenged. "Half a year of living with someone you can't just buy off or manipulate. Think about it, Alex. This would be the greatest test of your infamous self-control." Alexander was silent for a moment, taking in Gavin's proposition. He had never backed down from a challenge, and this one, while absurd, lit a fire of competitiveness within him. He pictured it as a game, something to conquer simply because it was there. But he was cautious. He knew Gavin well enough to suspect that the man was looking for entertainment and had singled out Alexander as the main event. You think I can't manage a 6-month marriage to someone unconventional? Alexander asked with a short laugh. I know you can't, Gavin said, swirling his scotch again, because this time, money won't solve your problems. This isn't just about paying for a lavish wedding or buying fancy jewelry. You'd have to live with her, embrace her world, her personality, her shape, her struggles. Alexander's jaw tightened at that last remark. Her shape. Gavin shrugged. It's no secret you prefer a certain look, slender, model-esque. Let's see you handle something different. A plus-size woman, perhaps. More importantly, someone from a completely different socioeconomic world. The bet was not merely about the physical aspect. It was about forcing Alexander out of his comfort zone in every possible way. A slow grin spread across Alexander's face. If Gavin thought he could rattle him, he'd learn otherwise. Alexander Pierce never refused a bet, never surrendered. All right, Gavin, he said, extending his hand. You have a deal. I'll marry your so-called opposite, and I'll stay married for 6 months. Gavin's eyes shone with mischief as he clasped Alexander's hand. I'll hold you to it, and trust me, I'll pick the perfect candidate. Alexander merely nodded, confident as ever. He couldn't imagine a scenario where he failed. With that handshake, however, the first thread of his carefully woven life was pulled loose, setting in motion changes more profound than he could possibly have anticipated. Alexander Pierce checked his expensive watch as the clock struck noon and stepped into Acadia Cafe, an upscale, discreet spot nestled in downtown Chicago. As always, he wore a perfectly tailored gray suit and polished leather shoes that exuded power and sophistication. Inside, Gavin Sinclair, his longtime friend and rival who thrived on challenging him, was already seated at a window table, sipping espresso with a sly smile. You're punctual as always, Gavin said, placing his cup on its saucer. You told me you'd found the perfect candidate. Let's hear it, Alexander replied with a calm but impatient tone. Gavin inclined his head toward a slim, unmarked envelope on the table. Everything you need is in here. Go ahead, have a look. Alexander retrieved the envelope and opened it with a certain nonchalance. He assumed it would be details about a modest but attractive woman, someone who wasn't part of his usual high society circle. But the second he pulled out the photo inside, his eyes went wide and his jaw slackened a fraction, betraying his composure. The image showed a curvy black woman with a round, pleasant face, a warm smile, and a distinctly plus-size figure. Her eyes shone with a confident yet gentle light. If he compared her to the lithe, fashion-forward women he typically dated, it was immediately clear. She was an absolute contrast to his usual type. What is this? He stammered, mouth slightly agape. Are you kidding me? Meet Naomi Walker, Gavin said, satisfaction glinting in his eyes. She's the director of a nonprofit organization called Elevate, working in some of the rough neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. Alexander was still reeling, his gaze fixed on the photograph. She's definitely not what I expected. Precisely, Gavin said with a self-assured smile. You always go for svelte blondes who fit perfectly into your lifestyle. This time, let's see how you manage with someone who's plus size, not wealthy, and definitely not from your elite world. Alexander leaned back in his chair, heart drumming a little faster than usual. A flicker of anxiety passed through him. So, you want me to marry her? He asked, as if to confirm the madness. Gavin shrugged casually. It won't be easy. You'll have to charm her, or use money, whichever method you prefer. But remember our bet. Marry this woman for at least 6 months, and I'll personally invest $50 million in your company. If you fail, or she leaves early, you get nothing. Alexander's eyes flicked to the photo one last time before he pressed his lips together, inhaling quietly to regain his composure. Pride and a stubborn streak fueled him. He'd never back down from a challenge. Fine, he said at last, forcing out a slightly stiff smile. I'll give it a try. Consider it the strangest deal of my career. Just the response I was hoping for, Gavin murmured, leaning back with a smirk. Even as he spoke, Alexander could still feel his pulse racing. A woman who looked and lived so differently from the people in his world. He couldn't deny the shock he'd felt upon seeing her photo. But a bet was a bet, and he would force himself to do what needed to be done. All that mattered now was convincing Naomi Walker to go along with it. Alexander wasted no time arranging a meeting with Naomi Walker. He contacted her under the guise of being a potential benefactor interested in philanthropic endeavors, particularly in Elevate, her grassroots organization dedicated to serving underprivileged communities in Chicago. Naturally, Naomi couldn't overlook a promise of sizable funding. So despite her reservations, she agreed to meet him at Pierce Financial's luxurious headquarters. When Naomi arrived in the opulent marble lobby, she felt slightly out of place among the gleaming chandeliers and meticulously dressed staff. Nevertheless, she held her head high as an assistant led her to Alexander's private office. There he was, seated behind a massive wooden desk, exuding an air of calm detachment in his impeccably tailored suit. Naomi began by passionately outlining Elevate's mission: food distribution programs, educational support for children, and vocational training for unemployed adults. Alexander listened politely, nodding occasionally, though his real focus was on crafting the proposition he'd been rehearsing since his last conversation with Gavin. When she finished, Alexander tinted his fingers, leaning back in his chair. "I'm interested in providing substantial financial support for your organization," he began. "Enough to expand multiple community centers around the city." Naomi's eyes flickered with cautious excitement. "That will be tremendous news. Elevate is always in need of resources." He inclined his head. "Yes, but my funding will come with a special arrangement. I want you to marry me." Naomi froze, her eyes going wide and her mouth falling open at the absurdity. "I'm sorry, excuse me?" She practically choked on her words, unable to fathom what she'd just heard. Alexander maintained a cool, measured tone, as though discussing a business deal. "Marry me for 6 months. In exchange, Elevate will receive a massive infusion of capital, and I'll enhance my public image as a philanthropist." Naomi stood there, stunned. The momentary confusion gave way to a fierce anger that kindled in her chest. She glared at the smug businessman before her. "Are you actually serious? You think you can just buy a marriage? And more importantly, buy me with your money?" He tried to keep his voice even. "I see it as a mutually beneficial agreement. You get the funds that can save your organization. I get the public perception of..." Before he could finish, Naomi's temper erupted. She snatched the water glass sitting on the desk and, with lightning speed, threw its contents straight into his face. Water splashed across his hair, his pristine suit, and the polished surface of his desk. Alexander jerked back, utterly shocked, his hands suspended in midair. His meticulously styled hair dripped water, and large wet splotches stained his suit jacket. For a solid second, he just stared in astonishment, completely at a loss for how to react. Naomi stood there, breathing hard, her hand still clutching the empty glass. "You arrogant jerk," she spat, her voice trembling with rage and hurt. "Marriage is not some bargaining chip you can wave around because you have a fat bank account." She slammed the glass onto the desk so hard that it rattled, then grabbed her bag. "Find another victim for your twisted scheme," she added bitterly, turning on her heel. The office door slammed behind her, leaving Alexander rooted to the spot, water dripping down his face. His shock slowly morphed into a mixture of confusion and dismay. He had never been rejected in such a dramatic and humiliating way. For the first time, he understood that this bet with Gavin might not be quite the easy victory he had assumed. Naomi spent the next few days oscillating between outrage and desperate consideration. She sat in her modest apartment on Chicago's South Side, flipping through budget reports for Elevate. The figures were grim. Rising rent costs for their main community center, the urgent need for new computers in the after-school program, and the ongoing search for sponsors to keep their food bank stocked. She couldn't sleep. Memories of her upbringing in the same struggling neighborhood flooded her mind. Nights when her mother had to skip dinner so Naomi could eat, or afternoons when the local community center was the only safe place from the violence on the streets. Elevate was her life's work, her way of paying it forward. Still, the idea of a marriage transaction felt wrong. She confided in her closest friend, Tara Lewis, a fellow social worker at Elevate. They met late one evening in the tiny, rundown office that doubled as a multi-purpose room for classes and group meetings. Tara listened in stunned silence as Naomi recounted Alexander's proposition. "You what? That's insane. Why would you even consider it?" Naomi sighed. "Tara, the donation he's talking about could triple our budget. We could expand to the west side, maybe. Even further. We could help so many more people." Tara looked torn, shaking her head in disbelief. "But marriage, Naomi? Are you ready to sign your life away for 6 months?" Naomi shrugged helplessly. "It's not about me. It's about the kids, the families. Half a year of discomfort might be worth it if it means saving lives." She tried to push down the anger she felt toward Alexander for turning something so sacred into a mere exchange. But each day that passed without an alternative solution made the offer loom larger in her mind. At last, Naomi made a decision. She scheduled a second meeting at Alexander's office. It was time to lay down her conditions if she was going to do this at all. They met in a smaller conference room this time, one with fewer glass walls and more privacy. Alexander offered Naomi a seat. Her posture was tense, but her gaze resolute. "All right, Mr. Pierce," she began, voice steady. "I'm considering your proposal, but I have demands." Alexander nodded, concealing a flicker of relief. "I'm listening." "First, I won't be reduced to some trophy wife," Naomi said. "I have my own life, my own job. I will continue to run Elevate day to day, and I won't compromise my values or my staff's mission for your image." "Agreed," Alexander said with a respectful inclination of his head. "Second, I want legal guarantees, funding locked in for Elevate, no strings attached, even if you decide to end this arrangement early. And you'll have no say in how we spend those funds." His gaze narrowed slightly. "I can accept that, as long as we remain married for the agreed-upon term, 6 months." She pressed her lips together. "Finally, I refuse to move out of Chicago's South Side. If we're to share a residence, you'll have to deal with my space or find something that isn't a gleaming skyscraper far away from the community I serve." Alexander inhaled slowly. He had a penthouse in a luxurious downtown building. Of course, he'd expected her to stay there. But Naomi's face was set with a steely determination that made it clear this was non-negotiable. "Fine," he said after a moment. "We'll figure out the living arrangements." Naomi nodded, though a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. "I'll have my lawyer review the final documents. If it all checks out, I'll do it." Alexander offered her his hand to shake. It felt surreal to both of them. A handshake for a marriage agreement, cold and transactional. Yet underneath the tension and formality, a ripple of something else passed between them, an awareness that neither fully understood. The wedding was a small, closed-door affair a few weeks later. Alexander arranged for a discreet ceremony in a private room at one of Chicago's premier hotel ballrooms. No photographers, no press, just a legally binding contract to satisfy the facade they intended to maintain in public. Naomi wore a simple white dress, knee-length, her hair styled in an elegant bun. She refused Alexander's offer of a high-end designer gown. It felt hypocritical to flaunt wealth while her organization still struggled for day-to-day survival. Meanwhile, Alexander wore a tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white rose in his lapel. The officiant cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of..." Naomi couldn't help tuning out for a moment. Her stomach knotted with conflicting emotions. She glanced up at Alexander. He appeared calm, but his eyes betrayed a hint of tension. She wondered if he felt even an ounce of the moral discomfort that was making her heart hammer. When it came time to exchange rings, the moment felt agonizingly empty. Alexander gently slid a simple gold band onto Naomi's finger. He had offered something lavish, but she chose a plain ring. In return, she placed a matching band on his hand. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, no one cheered. No one felt like celebrating what they both knew was a strategic transaction. Alexander offered Naomi a polite kiss on the cheek, and she stiffened, swallowing the lump in her throat. It was done. They were bound, if only for 6 months. And a future Naomi couldn't fully predict lay ahead. True to her word, Naomi refused to leave her neighborhood. So Alexander, after much protest, reluctantly arranged for a rental house on Chicago's South Side, just a few blocks from Elevate's main center. It was a modest, two-bedroom home with creaky floors and peeling paint, but it was close to the community. Naomi insisted that if he was going to understand her world, he needed to live in it. On their first night under the same roof, they moved around each other awkwardly. Naomi set up her meager belongings in one bedroom, while Alexander directed movers to drop off some of his clothes and essentials in the other. The rest of his possessions stayed in storage, waiting for the day the bet would end, or so he assumed. As evening fell, Naomi prepared a simple meal. In the outdated kitchen, chicken, vegetables, and rice. The overhead light flickered, and she made a mental note to ask the landlord about repairs. She was used to these inconveniences. Alexander, however, stared at the flickering bulb with a mix of bewilderment and annoyance. He almost never cooked, preferring Michelin-star restaurants or a private chef in his penthouse. Yet he observed Naomi carefully as she chopped vegetables with swift, efficient motions. He offered to help, but his slicing was clumsy, and she had to correct him. It was both comical and oddly intimate in a way neither had anticipated. They ate in a strained silence at a small table. Alexander commented on the flavor of the food, which Naomi found surprisingly polite. She'd half expected him to scoff at the humble setting. Instead, he seemed curious. After dinner, he cleared his throat. "Thank you for cooking. That was good." Naomi's brows lifted slightly. "You're welcome." He hesitated, glancing around the cramped living room. "I have a board meeting at 8 tomorrow morning, so I'll leave early." "That's fine," Naomi said with a shrug. "I'll be at Elevate by 7. We have a job training workshop for former inmates." "Early start." "Former inmates," Alexander repeated, trying and failing to mask his surprise. "I see." Naomi caught the flicker in his expression. "Yes, it's part of our reentry program. People who serve time often struggle to reintegrate, especially when it comes to finding stable employment." He nodded but didn't comment further. After a moment, they parted ways to their separate bedrooms, each feeling the tension of this newfound, uneasy arrangement. Over the next week, Alexander and Naomi developed a strange routine. By day, he was the powerful CEO overseeing multi-million-dollar deals, and she was the passionate nonprofit director juggling grants, meetings, and community programs. By night, they came home to the same modest house. Naomi continued to do most of the cooking, while Alexander ventured out to the grocery store, an experience that both amused and bewildered him. Used to personal shoppers, he found himself wandering aisles, trying to follow Naomi's list. He discovered how little he knew about everyday items and the cost of living in this part of town. Meanwhile, at Elevate, Naomi tried to keep her personal situation private. Tara and a few other close friends knew, but the rest of the staff and community simply assumed Naomi had come into some crucial funding. She felt guilty accepting congratulatory remarks about the nonprofit's sudden financial windfall, knowing it was tied to a sham marriage. But the funds had already begun to transform Elevate. They'd hired new staff, expanded their tutoring program, and initiated plans for a second center. Every time Naomi saw the excitement on kids' faces when they walked into a well-equipped classroom, she felt that maybe, just maybe, her compromise was worth it. On a crisp Friday morning, Naomi invited Alexander to visit Elevate. He was skeptical, but agreed. They drove together in his Bentley, which looked absurdly out of place, parked outside a community center surrounded by vacant lots and graffiti-tagged walls. Inside, the building thrummed with activity. Children scampered around. Volunteers sorted through donated clothes, and the aroma of a freshly prepared lunch for seniors floated through the halls. Naomi led Alexander through each section, explaining what they did. He listened, hands clasped behind his back. For once, he didn't ask cynical questions. He simply took it all in. When they reached the after-school study room, a group of teenagers was working on laptops. One of them, a lanky boy named Jerome, looked up and spotted Naomi. "Miss Walker," he called, grinning widely. "I aced my math quiz." "That's amazing," Naomi responded, giving him a high five. She turned to Alexander. "Jerome's been coming here for tutoring for the past 6 months." Alexander nodded. a flicker of respect passing through his eyes. He found himself strangely moved by the tangible impact of Naomi's efforts. He saw her hugging kids, offering encouragement to parents, and directing staff. With a calm but firm leadership style, she was no pushover, she was a force. At one point, a volunteer approached with a question about their new job training seminar. Naomi turned to Alexander. Actually, this might interest you. We're partnering with local businesses to create mentorships for people who've struggled to find work due to gaps in their resumes. It'd be great if Pierce Financial could consider hosting 1 or 2 participants. Alexander's immediate instinct was to refuse. His office was a polished fortress of suits, ties, and corporate jargon. But he paused, remembering the terms of the bet and the new sense of curiosity stirring within him. "I'll consider it," he said, not entirely convincingly. Naomi gave him a small smile. "That's all I ask." That evening, Alexander found himself tossing and turning in bed, reviewing his own emotions. He had never been involved in philanthropic work that went beyond writing checks for publicity. Seeing Elevate's direct impact was unsettling. It felt real, and real was something he wasn't used to. Meanwhile, Naomi was also restless. She couldn't ignore that her new husband, though arrogant and distant, was starting to show glimmers of empathy. Yet she guarded her heart fiercely, reminding herself this. Marriage was a short-term deal. A few days later, they attended a black-tie charity gala hosted by one of Alexander's business associates. Naomi wore a floor-length emerald dress that complemented her figure beautifully, even if she felt self-conscious among Chicago's high-society elite. Heads turned when they entered, many whispering speculations about the identity of Alexander's wife. Throughout the evening, Naomi tried to mingle politely, but the forced small talk about vacations in the Hamptons and yachts in the Caribbean left her cold. She couldn't help noticing the subtle, sometimes not so subtle, glances toward her plus-size body. In a culture obsessed with narrow beauty standards, she stood out like a beacon. During dinner, a socialite seated next to Naomi asked with feigned sweetness, "So, dear, how did you catch the eye of Alexander Pierce? You must be quite the charmer." Naomi forced a smile. "It's a long story," she said vaguely. The woman's gaze flickered over Naomi's dress, then lingered on her arms. "And you're involved in charity work, I hear?" "Not just involved," Naomi clarified, injecting pride into her voice. "I run Elevate, a nonprofit on the South Side that helps low-income families with everything from job training to food assistance." "How noble," the woman replied, quickly turning her attention to the next person when she realized Naomi's world was far from her own. Naomi's chest tightened with anger, but she remained poised. Across the table, Alexander caught the exchange. For a brief moment, guilt flickered in his expression. He knew she was out of her comfort zone, forced into his world under false pretenses. Later, when the event ended, they rode home in silence. The tension in the car was thick enough to slice with a knife. Finally, Naomi spoke. "That was a mistake. I don't belong in those circles." Alexander's jaw clenched. "If you want more funding, you'll have to mix with people like them. And degrade myself while they stare at me like some exhibit at the zoo?" Naomi snapped. "I won't do it." He exhaled, frustration evident. "Maybe you should. You're the face of Elevate now, especially with all the media coverage about our arrangement." Naomi turned away, staring out the window at the passing city lights. "This is exactly why I agreed to keep working from my neighborhood. I can't stomach these empty interactions." Alexander had no rebuttal. A flicker of shame coursed through him, and he turned away as, well, they rode the rest of the way in mutual resentment. Time marched on, each day blurring into the next. The initial novelty of their arrangement had worn off, and both Naomi and Alexander found themselves resentful at times. Their tension reached a boiling point one Saturday morning, sparked by a trivial argument about a broken coffee machine. "Your corporate card can buy a brand new espresso maker, can it?" Naomi snapped, rummaging through the kitchen drawers in search of a workable coffee filter. Alexander frowned, leaning against the counter in his designer pajama pants. "If it bothers you so much, I'll replace it. But you don't have to be rude." She slammed a drawer shut. "I'm not being rude. I'm being realistic." We're living in a house that's falling apart, and you're acting as though it's perfectly fine because it's temporary for you." His face hardened. "It is temporary. 6 months, remember? Unless you want to extend our deal." Naomi felt her cheeks burn. "Absolutely not." They stared at each other, anger simmering. In that moment, they were forced to confront the underlying truth. They were living together like two strangers forced into a cramped cage. Their respective worlds felt impossible to merge. Abruptly, Naomi stormed out, slamming the door behind her. She spent the day at Elevate, helping set up a weekend community fair. Her staff noticed her uncharacteristic agitation, but she brushed off their concern. Meanwhile, Alexander spent the day at the gym and then retreated to his downtown penthouse, making calls to business partners. The fight over the coffee maker was just a symptom of the deeper fault line running between them. That night, however, something unexpected happened. Naomi was cleaning up after the community fair, picking up trash, folding tables, and organizing leftover supplies, when a thunderstorm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain pounded on the sidewalks. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice call her name. She turned to see Alexander rushing under the awning, drenched, carrying a large umbrella. "What are you doing here?" she shouted over the roar of the rain. He stepped closer, water dripping off his expensive coat. "I called your phone. You didn't answer. I thought I should check if you need a ride." Naomi's tension eased a fraction. She rubbed her arms, drenched from the sudden downpour. "I was busy cleaning. My phone's in my bag." Alexander lifted the umbrella over her head, shielding her from the rain. "Let's get you home." Together, they loaded the leftover supplies into Naomi's car, ignoring the water seeping into their shoes. Then she locked up the center, and they ducked into Alexander's Bentley. He turned on the heat, and the interior lights revealed their soggy clothes and the exhaustion etched into Naomi's face. She glanced at him, her voice softer. "You didn't have to come." He shrugged, eyes fixed on the windshield. "I know, but I did." They drove through the storm in silence. When they reached the little house, the power was out. Naomi let out a groan, fumbling in the dark. Alexander found a flashlight in a kitchen drawer, and they lit a few candles. The soft glow cast dancing shadows across the old walls. They sat together at the kitchen table, wrapped in blankets. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the windows in staccato bursts. In that small circle of candlelight, something changed. The bitter tension between them eased, replaced by an odd comfort in the shared predicament. Naomi managed a small laugh. "So much for the glamorous billionaire life." Huh. Alexander let out a dry chuckle. "I've had worse nights." She arched an eyebrow. "Somehow, I doubt that." His gaze flickered to hers. "It's different. I'll give you that." They remained in a charged silence for a moment. Naomi studied his face in the soft light, noting the fatigue in his eyes. She wondered what it was like to be him, constantly performing a role, never showing weakness. Suddenly, she felt a pang of empathy. "You know," she said quietly, "I appreciate you checking on me." That was thoughtful. Alexander hesitated, then gave a small nod. "You're welcome." They said nothing more, but the storm outside felt less ominous as they shared a silent truce. In the weeks following the stormy night, Alexander found himself more drawn to Elevate than ever before. He began to appear unannounced at the center, chatting with volunteers and occasionally helping to carry boxes or sort donations. While some staff members were intimidated by him, others grew to appreciate his willingness to engage. One day, Naomi caught him in conversation with Marisol, a single mother of two who had found stable housing through Elevate's assistance. Marisol was describing how the program's childcare support allowed her to keep a job at a retail store. Alexander listened intently, occasionally asking questions that betrayed a deepening understanding of what poverty really meant. He no longer carried himself with the aloof arrogance that Naomi had witnessed before. It was as if he was learning, for the first time, that the world did not revolve around him. After Marisol left, Naomi approached. "I didn't know you were coming today." He straightened. "I had a light schedule at the office and thought I'd drop by." She studied him curiously. "That's becoming a habit." Alexander shrugged. glancing around at the bustling hallway of the community center. I guess I'm starting to see the value in what you do. Here, Naomi's heart softened slightly. This was no longer just about the bed, was it? She could sense a genuine shift in his perspective. Despite her lingering anger over the nature of their marriage, she couldn't deny that he seemed changed at least somewhat. Yet, a gnawing doubt remained. She didn't know how real his transformation was, or if it would last beyond the 6-month contract. Just as Alexander was beginning to question everything, Gavin Sinclair reappeared. He arranged a swanky dinner at a Michelin star restaurant, claiming he wanted to catch up. Alexander showed up in a tailored suit, nerves thrumming. He knew exactly why Gavin had summoned him. They exchanged pleasantries over a bottle of red wine, discussing stock performance and real estate prospects. Eventually, Gavin leaned forward, a conspiratorial grin on his face. "So, Alexander," he said, tapping the rim of his wine glass. "How's married life with Ms. Naomi Walker?" Alexander's lips thinned. "It's fine. And the bet?" Gavin asked, arching an eyebrow. "I recall you were supposed to prove you could handle a woman outside your comfort zone for 6 months." Alexander felt a surge of anger. He suddenly realized how cruel and demeaning the entire premise was. He had been so eager to accept the challenge, without considering the insult it hurled at Naomi's dignity. "I'm still in it," Alexander said coolly, a tension in his shoulders. "But things are different than I expected." Gavin smirked. "Different? Don't tell me you're actually falling for the woman." Alexander's face darkened. "This isn't a joke, Gavin." "Oh, lighten up," Gavin said with a dismissive wave. "A bet's a bet, right? If you last the 6 months, I'll deposit the $50 million into Pierce Financial. Though I must say, I'm surprised you haven't found a reason to exit yet. She's hardly the type I'd picture on your arm at those society galas." Alexander clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to upend the wine. He saw now that Gavin was a vulture, circling for cheap entertainment. And worse yet, Alexander had allowed himself to be part of this twisted game. He stood abruptly. "Excuse me, where are you going?" Gavin asked, clearly taken aback. "I have no interest in continuing this conversation," Alexander snapped. "I'll be in touch." Leaving behind a startled Gavin, Alexander strode out of the restaurant. His heart pounded, not merely with anger, but with guilt. Naomi was in the dark about the entire bet, and the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how unbelievably wrong he had been. That night, Alexander returned to the Southside house, only to find Naomi sitting in the living room, going over a stack of reports. She looked up when he entered, noting the stormy expression on his face. "What happened?" she asked, setting aside the papers. Alexander ran a hand through his hair. Part of him wanted to spare her the truth. But how could he maintain this charade any longer, now that he recognized he genuinely respected, perhaps even cared for, this woman? He sank onto the couch across from her, every muscle tense. "Naomi," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." She frowned, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "What is it?" He swallowed hard. "I didn't marry you just for public image or philanthropic reasons. My friend, Gavin Sinclair, he made a bet with me. $50 million of investment if I could marry someone like you for 6 months and stay married. That's how this all started." Naomi's face drained of color. She stared at him, stunned. "A bet? Like I'm some challenge you had to conquer?" Her words were laced with equal parts hurt and anger. Alexander had never felt more ashamed. He tried to reach for her hand, but she recoiled as though he were toxic. "I swear it's not like that now," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "At first, yes, it was about the bet. But everything changed when I got to know you, when I realized what you stand for and the good you do." Naomi stood abruptly, heart pounding, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. "How dare you? You manipulated me into a fake marriage for a game? After everything I've shared with you about my community, my struggles, my life?" She was trembling, torn between fury and heartbreak. The gravity of his betrayal was almost too large to fathom. If he had told her this a month ago, she might have walked away immediately, but now, Alexander's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I know I can't undo what I did, but I had to tell you the truth. I want you to know how much I regret." "Regret?" Naomi spat. It's too late for regret, Alexander. Before he could respond, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through the house, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of his transgression. He sank back onto the couch, head in his hands, realizing just how thoroughly he had destroyed the fragile trust they'd built. Naomi fled to Tara's apartment, tears streaming down her cheeks. She felt utterly humiliated, used as some sort of pawn in a wealthy man's game. Over cups of hot tea, Tara listened to Naomi's furious outpouring, offering comforting words. I let my guard down, Naomi said, voice trembling. I actually started believing he was sincere about helping the community and about caring for me as a person. Tara placed a reassuring hand on her arm. People like him don't change overnight, Naomi. But you're not at fault. He deceived you. Naomi spent the night on Tara's couch, mind racing. She knew, logically, that the funds Alexander had provided were helping Elevate in profound ways. But at what personal cost? She was reeling from the betrayal, unsure how to proceed. Meanwhile, Alexander retreated to his downtown penthouse, feeling more hollow than ever. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the massive windows overlooking the city. For years, he had lived exactly as he pleased, never once bothering to consider how his actions affected others. Now, the sickening realization of what he'd done consumed him. He spent the next few days in a fog, ignoring calls from Gavin and half-heartedly going through the motions at work. For the first time, deals and profits felt meaningless. Everything he had once valued now seemed trivial. Despite Naomi's absence, Alexander continued funneling money into Elevate, as promised. He even donated additional funds to launch new programs, without expecting any public credit. The staff at Elevate found it peculiar that these donations kept arriving, given that Naomi was barely speaking to him. She eventually returned to the South Side house, only to gather some of her belongings. Alexander was there, pacing anxiously. When Naomi walked in, he froze. She wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm moving out, she said flatly. Alexander's chest constricted. But where will you live? Back in my old apartment, she said. I never gave it up completely. One of my staff members was subletting for a while. He swallowed. I know I can't ask for forgiveness, but please, let me keep helping Elevate. I'll do it quietly, without strings. Naomi was silent for a moment, wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to throw his charity back in his face. Another part recognized that the community needed every dollar. And if he truly felt remorse, maybe that money was the only good thing to come out of this fiasco. Fine, she said curtly. Elevate isn't mine alone. It belongs to the community. If your funds help them, I won't stand in the way. Alexander nodded, relieved but heartbroken. As she left with her suitcase, he felt like the biggest fool in the world. He had gained billions in the corporate world, yet lost the one chance he might have had at genuine connection. Despite her personal turmoil, Naomi didn't let her heartbreak affect her duties. Under her leadership, Elevate continued to grow. They opened a new satellite center on the west side, launched expanded literacy programs, and even started a small business incubator for local entrepreneurs. One cool autumn afternoon, they held a block party to celebrate the community's achievements. Dozens of families, volunteers, and local artists gathered in the street. There were food stalls, music, and booths showcasing Elevate services. Naomi circulated among the crowd, smiling at the joyous atmosphere. She paused when she spotted a familiar figure, Alexander, standing near a booth where local teenagers were selling handmade crafts. He looked out of place in casual jeans and a button-down shirt, but he was quietly engaging with the teenagers, asking about their plans to use the proceeds for college savings. Naomi's heart pounded. She thought about walking away. She still hadn't fully processed her anger toward him, but something made her stay. Slowly she approached. He turned, spotting her with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Naomi. She folded her arms, keeping her distance. I didn't know you were coming. He offered a tentative smile. I wanted to see the new programs. I've been following the updates. She noted the sincerity in his tone. He seemed different, less stiff, more grounded. Well, as you can see, "We're doing fine without you," she said, a slight edge in her voice. He gave a small nod. "I'm glad." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the sounds of laughter and music swirling around them. At last, Naomi found her voice. "Thank you for the continued donations, by the way." "It's the least I can do," he replied, voice gentle. "I know I can't make up for the hurt I caused." She studied him for a long moment. There was no flash of arrogance, no hint of the smug billionaire she'd first encountered. Only regret and a quiet resolve. "Excuse me," Naomi said at length, turning away to greet another guest. She wasn't ready for a heart-to-heart with Alexander, but at least she could speak to him without rage coursing through her veins. A few days after the block party, Naomi received a phone call from an unlikely source, one of Alexander's board members, inviting her to speak at a peer's financial event about philanthropic partnerships. Her initial reaction was to decline. She wanted nothing to do with Alexander's corporate world. But the board member explained that the event was an opportunity to secure further partnerships for Elevate from other big corporations. They had heard about her success stories and believed her insights could be valuable. Naomi wrestled with her emotions. If it meant more resources for her community, was she willing to stand on a stage with Alexander's colleagues? Ultimately, she decided to go. The event was held in a luxurious hotel ballroom, with a dais set up for speakers. Naomi arrived in a professional black pantsuit, determined to keep this strictly about business. She spotted Alexander in the audience, surrounded by executives in tailored suits. When she took the stage, she spoke passionately about Elevate's work, sharing stories of transformed lives and highlighting the crucial role that corporate funds could play, if used ethically and responsibly. She concluded with a call to action, challenging the audience to engage with communities rather than just writing checks for tax breaks. As the room erupted in applause, Naomi glanced at Alexander. His eyes glistened with what appeared to be genuine admiration. After the session, several companies approached her, expressing interest in forming partnerships. Naomi felt a swell of pride, knowing she had not compromised her message. Before she left, Alexander caught up to her near the exit. "Naomi, your speech was incredible." She gave a curt nod. "I only speak the truth. We're always in need of real support from corporations who truly care." Alexander swallowed. "I'd like to continue supporting you in any capacity I can." Even if, he paused, struggling with the words, "even if there's no future for us." Naomi was silent for a moment, her lips pressed tight. She was torn between the bitterness she still felt and the undeniable fact that he had changed in ways she never thought possible. "I won't turn away resources for my community," she said finally. "But this doesn't fix what you did." "I know," he murmured. "I just hope in time you'll see I'm more than that mistake." She didn't respond, merely walked away. Her heart pounded with a confusing mix of unresolved feelings. With the 6-month mark of their marriage looming, Naomi realized she had a decision to make. The initial contract would end, and she could free herself from Alexander permanently by filing the divorce papers. Some days, she felt certain that was the path she wanted, a complete severing of ties. Yet every time she thought about severing those ties, a nagging sense of unfinished business tugged at her. She had seen Alexander's transformation firsthand, his genuine interest in Elevate, his willingness to invest time in the community, and his consistent respect toward her boundaries after the confession. She couldn't ignore that he had proven himself an unexpected ally in her mission. Meanwhile, Alexander grappled with his own feelings of guilt and longing. He had astonishingly come to care for Naomi in a way he never anticipated. The bet felt like a distant, disgraceful memory. All he wanted now was a chance, a real chance, to show her his heart. But he feared the damage might be irreversible. As the weeks ticked down, they saw each other only occasionally at nonprofit events or city meetings. Each encounter felt loaded with tension, yet also flickered with a faint spark of something neither had the courage to name. On the final weekend before their 6-month term ended, Chicago was hit by an unexpected cold snap and thunderstorms. Elevate was hosting a crucial fundraiser at their newest center. Naomi was there, managing the final details, when she received a frantic call from one of their volunteers. The nearby homeless shelter had flooded due to heavy rains, and dozens of people needed temporary housing. Without hesitation, Naomi mobilized her staff and started converting the center's multi-purpose rooms into makeshift sleeping quarters. They laid out mats, pillows, blankets, and organized hot meals. But the number of displaced people was growing rapidly, more than they had space for. As she assessed the chaotic scene, she felt a light tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Alexander standing there, water dripping from his coat. "You again?" she asked, eyebrows raised. He gave a tight smile. "I heard about the flooding on the news. Thought I could help." Naomi nodded, too exhausted to question him. "We need more blankets, food supplies, and some partition screens for privacy. And possibly portable heaters if this storm gets worse." "I'll send for them," Alexander said without missing a beat. He pulled out his phone and began making calls right away. Within an hour, trucks arrived loaded with the items Naomi had requested, courtesy of Alexander's extensive corporate contacts. Working side by side, they organized the newcomers, set up sleeping areas, and listened to people's stories of displacement. By midnight, the center was filled with the sounds of people settling in, children crying softly, volunteers rushing to accommodate every need. Naomi paused to catch her breath, leaning against a wall. Her hair was damp, her eyes heavy with fatigue. Alexander approached, equally tired. "You're good at this," he said softly. "Good at what?" "Being there for people, showing empathy, making them feel safe. It's a rare gift." She shrugged. "It's what I do." He nodded, looking around. "I see that now. I'm sorry I ever doubted your impact." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the rest of the room faded. A tiny spark of understanding passed between them, perhaps something close to forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it. They stood there in silence, letting the weight of their collective experiences settle. 2 days later, the heavy rain subsided, and the crisis passed. Naomi and her team coordinated with city services to find more permanent solutions for those temporarily housed at Elevate. Alexander quietly paid for hotel rooms for a handful of families who had nowhere else to go. When the dust settled, Naomi took a moment to reflect. The official end of their 6-month contract was just around the corner. She hadn't filed divorce papers yet, too caught up in the recent emergency to even think about it. But now, the deadline loomed like a final bell. In the early evening, Naomi found herself alone in the main hall of Elevate, packing up leftover supplies. The overhead lights cast a dim glow on the scuffed floors. She heard footsteps and turned to see Alexander approaching, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the documents. He exhaled slowly. "The marriage contract. It expires soon. I brought the paperwork to finalize our divorce if that's what you want." Naomi froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She recalled all the heartbreak, the anger, the sense of betrayal. But she also remembered the day Alexander had shown up in a thunderstorm to help, the nights he spent volunteering, the quiet humility he displayed in recent weeks. "Is it what you want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alexander swallowed, meeting her gaze. "No, but I won't force you into something you don't want. I've done enough damage." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Then, with surprising gentleness, she took the papers from him and set them on a nearby table. "I'm not signing these yet." His heart hammered. "Why?" She looked up, eyes glistening. "Because, somehow, despite everything, you've changed. And I need to know if that change is real, if it lasts beyond any bet or contract." Alexander dared to take a single step closer. "I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if you'll let me." She offered a small, uncertain smile. "Then show me, not through grand gestures or money, but by being present, by continuing to care about these people long after there's no contract compelling you." He nodded fervently. "I will. I promise." They stood there in a quiet, fragile truce. For the first time, a sense of genuine hope fluttered in both their chests. While the path ahead was uncertain, they were at least facing it together, no longer adversaries, but something closer to allies, and maybe one day, something more. Over the next several months, Naomi watched as Alexander remained steadfast in his commitment to Elevate. No longer burdened by the secrecy of the bed, he pursued genuine philanthropy. He set up scholarship funds, arranged training programs in partnership with local businesses, and spent evenings volunteering without the glare of media cameras. The city began to take notice. Alexander Pierce's reputation evolved from that of a cold-hearted financier to a philanthropist who actually rolled up his sleeves. While some still questioned his motives, Naomi saw his sincerity, day by day, in the countless little actions that required no spotlight. Their personal relationship was equally cautious. Naomi was slow to trust, and Alexander respected her boundaries. They no longer lived in separate worlds. He spent more time in the South Side house, though he still used his downtown penthouse for late-night work sessions. Their dinners were sometimes still awkward, but they occasionally shared quiet conversations that stretched into the night. One Sunday afternoon, Naomi took him to visit her childhood church, a modest building on a street lined with shuttered shops. The congregation greeted Alexander with curiosity and a bit of skepticism, but Naomi introduced him as a friend who had been helping the community. He listened to the pastor's sermon on redemption and second chances with solemn intensity. Afterwards, as they walked home, Naomi sensed a shift in him, a spiritual dimension she hadn't seen before. He didn't speak much about it, but she could tell the idea of real transformation resonated deeply with him. In time, they found themselves standing in front of the very place where their improbable union had begun. The house on the south side had been refurbished with fresh paint and new appliances. Alexander's doing, even though Naomi insisted on modest upgrades. The broken coffee machine was long gone, replaced by a robust, simple model that Naomi knew how to operate with ease. He turned to her on the porch one evening, the sunset bathing the neighborhood in a warm glow. "I was thinking," he began quietly, "about renewing our vows." Naomi's eyes widened. "Our vows?" "Yes," he said, swallowing. "But for real this time. No contracts, no bets. Just us choosing to be together. Only if you're ready." Naomi studied his face and saw an open vulnerability she would never have believed possible. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she nodded slowly. "I think I'd like that." A gentle smile blossomed on Alexander's face, and he reached for her hand. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city in the distance, the echoes of their tumultuous past overshadowed by a promise of the future. In that simple, unassuming setting, Naomi Walker and Alexander Pierce took the first steps of an authentic journey. One built not on wagers and wealth, but on understanding, shared purpose, and the quiet power of second chances. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Don't forget to turn on notifications. See you soon.